If the capacity to carry out terror remains intact and the strategic willingness to do so also remains intact, then that would suggest that we will have more terror attacks. And given the new doctrine that Mr. Modi has enunciated, that every act of terror will be seen as a declaration of war, we will also have another war. Both things follow from what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that it's likely. I don't think it's inevitable. It would really depend on the Pakistani military intelligence choices, right? If they decide to at some point up the ante against India, and there's another terror attack, Mr. Modi obviously has made that commitment, right? So it will be very hard to back out, and it's quite likely that there might be a cycle of, Indian attack, Pakistan's counter attack. So what I'm trying to say is that this is very dangerous, and this is on both sides, in a sense, risk taking. And because of the presence of nuclear weapons, this risk taking is, eventually, God forbid, it could become catastrophic, as you can imagine.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Although the ceasefire between India and Pakistan prevails, Operation Sindoor is only paused. There is therefore a critical question that needs answering. Is another war between India and Pakistan likely, perhaps even inevitable? The answer hinges upon a set of further questions. Has Pakistan been deterred? Does it believe it's identified weaknesses in India's air defenses? Have the Pakistani army chief and the country's top generals changed their thinking? And does Pakistan believe it can gain by taking on India yet again? Those are issues that have been recently addressed in an essay in Foreign Affairs magazine called The Next War Between India and Pakistan. I'm now joined by the author, a visiting professor at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Affairs at Georgetown University, Aqil Shah. Professor Shah joins us live from Washington, D.C. Professor Shah, in a recent essay you've written for Foreign Affairs, you make two important points. First, India has failed to deter Islamabad, and second, this will fuel future violence between both countries. You write, and I'm quoting you, rather than deterring its rival, India ended up burnishing the Pakistani military's reputation and boosting its domestic popularity. India's retribution has handed the Pakistan army its biggest symbolic victory in recent decades, and that will hardly discourage Islamabad from reigning in the proxy war against New Delhi or risking future flare-ups. So are you saying another war between India and Pakistan is not just likely, but very possibly inevitable?
Thank you, Karan, for inviting me. It's a privilege. I don't think anything is inevitable in international relations. Leaders make rational or clear choices, and those choices can often lead to consequences that may be inevitable. So the idea is that, the Indian leadership decided, right, to carry out missile strikes against Pakistan. That was a deliberate choice, and Pakistan then retaliated in kind. Which shows that Pakistan has the capability to respond to India's conventional superiority, aggregate conventional superiority, by keeping the conflict keeping the conflict sorry, let me rephrase that. India does not have the what you would call a superiority in the theater of conflict. So Pakistan can retaliate to India's attacks, whether they are from the air or from the ground. And so, because these capabilities are matched, I don't think India has deterred Pakistan. Deterrence would have been working if, after Operation Sindoor's first round, Pakistan had just not responded, right? Pakistan, at every stage of the conflict or the crisis, Pakistan was able to respond to India's escalation in an appropriate and corresponding manner. And so, if India had the ability to dominate or to show its superiority, let's say in the air, at every stage of the conflict, then Pakistan would have been deterred. But at the moment, it seems there's really no evidence that India can sort of can show escalation dominance, if that.
In fact, in that essay that you've written for Foreign Affairs, you very specifically question India's claim that it deterred Pakistan. You write, its attempt to re-establish deterrence backfired. The recent hostilities will likely have the opposite effect. Indian attacks on militant sites in Muridke and Bahawalpur did little to damage Pakistan's jihadi infrastructure. The ISI had ample time to relocate its prime assets to safety. And then you add, Pakistan fully retains its capacity to use terrorism to rattle India. So do you believe that in the fullness of time there will be more terrorist attacks, and that in turn makes another war likely?
Well, I hope not, but there is no reason to believe that Pakistan's long-standing policy of using militants or its strategic assets against India, and the Pakistani generals think of this primarily as a strategy to reduce the larger military superiority that India has. So India is a much larger country, militarily powerful, economically bigger. But these strategies, such as subconventional warfare through proxies, allows Pakistan to remedy the superiority that India has in terms of conventional military power.
But you're saying two important things. A, Pakistan's capacity to use terror remains intact.
Yes,
it hasn't been destroyed.
Yeah.
And secondly, Pakistan's strategic willingness to do so continues as well.
Yes. I mean, destroying buildings may be good optics, but it doesn't really achieve much in the way of destroying the capacity of these militant groups, and let alone their willingness to strike back in India, whether it's in Kashmir or in mainland India. And Pakistan's policy to use these assets, there is really no indication that Pakistan's army will have changed this policy, because, as India claims, it has been able to deter Pakistan by these attacks, which went deeper into Pakistan, did not remain restricted to the border region, Kashmir. So there's, Pakistan's ability, the Pakistani military's ability to patronize, support, and sustain these groups still remains intact. And because Pakistan was able to hold its own during Operation Sindoor and in response to it, there's really no incentive for the generals to think otherwise.
So just to sum that up, if the capacity to carry out terror remains intact and the strategic willingness to do so also remains intact, then that would suggest that we will have more terror attacks. And given the new doctrine that Mr. Modi has enunciated, that every act of terror will be seen as a declaration of war, we will also have another war. Both things follow from what you're saying.
Yeah. I think that it's likely. I don't think it's inevitable. It would really depend on the Pakistani military intelligence choices, right? If they decide to, at some point, up the ante against India, and there's another terror attack, Mr. Modi obviously has made that commitment, right? So it will be very hard to back out. And it's quite likely that there might be a cycle of, Indian attack, Pakistan's counterattack. So what I'm trying to say is that this is very dangerous. And this is on both sides, in a sense, risk-taking. And because of the presence of nuclear weapons, this risk-taking is, eventually, God forbid, it could become catastrophic, as you can imagine.
I come to the nuclear threshold and nuclear weapons in a moment's time, but let me quote you what India's Chief of Defense Staff, General Chauhan, said in an interview in Singapore on Saturday. He said India has drawn a new red line of intolerance against terror. You're suggesting to me that this red line is not visible in Pakistan, or if it's visible, it's not acknowledged by Pakistani generals as a red line. In other words, it's Indian rhetoric, but it doesn't matter to Pakistani generals.
I think you're right, because Pakistan retains the military capability to respond, right? If India carried out attacks and Pakistan thought that responding would be a losing bet, then that might have incentivized Pakistani decision makers to change their thinking. But because they've been able to respond and match up India's military capabilities at every sort of stage of the crisis that we just saw unfold, they are actually more emboldened. They believe that they have both the capacity and obviously the resolve, right, to show India that you cannot get away with, just striking Pakistan at whenever you wish, and that there will be costs to pay in terms of Pakistan's ability not only to respond to India conventionally, but also at the sub-conventional level through proxy warfare.
Capacity and resolve are two very important components of the thinking of Pakistan's generals, but there is a third that you identify in your Foreign Affairs article. You write, Operation Sindoor encouraged Pakistan to test Indian air defenses, and it revealed the limitations of India's presumed air supremacy, renewing the Pakistani military's confidence that it can hold its own in a limited conflict despite India's conventional superiority. This perception that India's presumed air supremacy has limitations has also emboldened Pakistani generals, hasn't it?
Clearly, the fact that Pakistan has, with some plausibility claimed that they were able to shoot down Indian jets, and now there's more and more evidence that that's actually true. If there was a general belief that India has an edge over Pakistan in terms of aerial warfare, that belief, I think, has been exposed to be exaggerated. I think India, in a sense, overestimated its aerial warfare capabilities, and the Pakistani Air Force has shown that it does retain it has the technological edge at the moment, right, to be able to shoot down Indian jets. And even though losing a jet or two is not, in a combat situation, it's quite normal. But because India refused to acknowledge that had happened, it gave Pakistan the ability to sort of play that up. And it's obviously clear that Pakistan's general will be confident that, India, despite its larger conventional forces, will not be able to sort of defeat Pakistan, at least in a limited conflict, in a limited context.
Let me put you, Professor Shah, that the view from Delhi, as expressed by the Indian government and as expressed by India's generals, is almost the opposite of what you're saying. India believes that it overcame Pakistan's air defenses, as a result of which it was able to badly damage Air Force bases at Chaklala, Rahim Yar Khan, Sargodha, Jacobabad, and Bholari. In fact, PTV, which is Pakistan's official national television channel, broadcast a speech by Prime Minister Sharif where he confirms that Indian BrahMos missiles damaged Pakistan's Air Force base in Rawalpindi. So to many hearing you, that will seem like the opposite of what you're saying. They will say that, in fact, it was Pakistan's air defenses, not India's, that were found wanting.
It's quite possible that India's air defense systems are, let's say, superior to Pakistan's. The problem with that assumption is that it's not markedly superior in the sense that Pakistan doesn't have the ability, right, to inflict damage on India. Now, that damage may be, sort of India's ability to, let's say, attack Pakistani air bases deep inside Pakistani territory may still be superior. But the point is that the New York Times analysis, for instance, showed that even though India was able to penetrate Pakistani airspaces and damage these airports and runways, the damage was limited, right? So in a sense, Pakistan, at least the Pakistani military's perception would be, this is not something we cannot tackle, right? That we still have the ability to, even if not perfectly match India's attacks, but the ability to respond in kind, and that India doesn't have the dominance or the edge or superiority that it claims. At least that's how they perceive it.
Let's for a moment come back to your essay and talk about what you reveal of the thinking and the attitude of Pakistan's generals, because that is in fact critical to this discussion. Capacity and resolve are one thing, but if the thinking and attitude of generals weakens or is not emboldened, the situation could change. You write that before the 4-day war, the public image of the Pakistan army and that of its chief general Asim Munir had plummeted. Now, the military has been able to present itself as a triumphant force. Munir has emerged stronger. As a result, you say Pakistan's generals are more determined to stand up to India with their domestic position bolstered and their battlefield reputation enhanced. In other words, it seems to me that you're suggesting that Pakistan's generals have the attitude and the resolve to take on India again if need be. They're not shying away from that. They're prepared to do it if they have to do it.
I think that's absolutely right, because at a time when Pakistan was deeply polarized and General Munir and the army had a public reputation that was, you could say, in shambles because of the repression that the army engaged in against Imran Khan's Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. And so for the military at this stage, India may have delivered the best gift they could imagine, is because when you have conflict, right, there is nothing that unites like hate of the enemy or the rival. And so in Pakistan, there has been a strong rally around the flag effect. And that might at least temporarily dampen whatever resentments and criticism the Pakistani army was facing. As you can see, their celebration, General Munir was elevated to the position of Field Marshal. And so he has emerged as this heroic figure, right? Who basically did not blink when India attacked. And it also feeds into this larger assumption. Most middle class educated Pakistanis would have otherwise thought, or there is this belief that Pakistan, is a somewhat weak state. Its economy is in dire straits. But the fact that you were able to parry your main adversary in battle, that has, not only removed that deep despair in Pakistan, at least temporarily, but also given the military a symbolic victory which it can use to then strengthen itself further, both in domestic politics, but also militarily, because now Pakistan can say, look, we may have some capability gaps with India. We need more of, better, more expensive, more technologically advanced radar systems. And so it could set up a sort of arms race in the region, in which Pakistan ultimately, cannot sustain as much as India can because of its general economic sort of capabilities.
But you make a further deeper point about the thinking and what you call the socialization, not just Pakistan's generals, but the entire officer corps of the Pakistan army. You're right. Pakistani officers are socialized into an organizational culture that fixates on India as an implacably hostile neighbor. The recent fighting has not shaken these convictions. Indeed, Pakistan's generals are not about to change course, and India's attacks may suggest to the generals that their provocative strategy is working, and I would add to that they then feel safe to continue with that provocative strategy. If it's worked once, they'll believe it'll work again. In other words, because they're almost indoctrinated to see India as an enemy, they've interpreted everything that's happened as India's weakness and playing to their strength.
Yes, and that reinforces those assumptions, right? That India, for instance, in this case, that there's absolutely no evidence of Pakistani involvement in Pahalgam, and that the Hindu nationalist government, Prime Minister Modi, that has made Pakistan sort of the main enemy in Indian domestic politics. The fact that Prime Minister Modi in 2019 and again in 2025 attacked Pakistan reinforces that assumption that India really is the enemy that we need to stand up to. And it's an enemy that the conflict, that the only way, sorry, let me rephrase, that the only way to sort of keep Pakistan safe, keep Pakistan's territorial integrity then is for the military to be the ultimate guardian of both internal and external security. And so every time India retaliates or attacks to a potential or an alleged provocation from Pakistan, that actually reinforces that professional belief, that professional sort of conviction that the India is the, as I said, implacable enemy. And the only way we can survive this is by strengthening our military, by strengthening our ability to match India's capabilities.
And side by this remains the capacity and the resolve to use terror as a strategic instrument whenever the opportunity provides itself. Which is why I began by saying, let's leave out the word inevitable, but another war is very likely. Because another attack of terror is very likely, therefore another war is very likely.
Yes, if there is another terror attack in India, and I think this so-called new normal is the idea that India will seek retribution against Pakistan without attribution, right? That there's no more, India doesn't feel the need anymore to provide actual evidence of Pakistani involvement. And so that also reduces India's threshold of retaliating against a subconventional attack in India to Pakistan, right? So because both sides actually came out of this crisis believing that they achieved their goals, India, that Pakistan has been deterred, and Pakistan's military believing that India is unable to deter. So this is essentially an unstable situation because both sides are willing to take risky decisions, right? Those decisions may turn out to be self-defeating, but their belief in their capability to strike the other, whether it's for domestic political reasons or for military strategic purposes, it's very much intact.
And in fact, you make that precise point in the last sentence of your essay for Foreign Affairs. You say, any respite from violence will likely be temporary as long as one side still believes that it has something to gain from assailing the other. And the truth is that at the moment, both sides believe they can gain, which is why once again, I would put to you, another war does look likely. We can't say when, but clearly with both sides believing they have the upper hand, that looks as if it will be the case.
In addition to those perceptions of victory or superiority, there's also the underlying problem of disputes between the two countries that have remained unresolved for over 75 years. So because let's take the problem, Pakistan sees Kashmir as the sort of main source of this conflict between India and Pakistan. And so as long as this conflict festers, as long as this sort of conflict endures, because of the two sides' positions, sort of maximalist positions, India's belief that Kashmir is an integral part of India, Pakistan has the same belief, that sort of position will make the conflict endure over time and reduce the opportunity or the space for both sides to engage in a dialogue, to sort of, cool things down, bring the sort of conflict to the table and negotiate, right? Because there's no point to a war or a military solution unless it has a political objective. And the political objective is that, my view is that Pakistan and India cannot shoot their way out of this conflict. By geography, they're stuck together. And so they have to find a way to peacefully settle their dispute. Otherwise, this process, it's gone on for 75 years. Given that they're now nuclear powers, every time there's a conflict, they go closer and closer to the edge. And so for both states, for the region in large and the international community, this is a situation that is risky, that it's unstable.
I take your point completely, that the solution to the problem will have to come through dialogue and negotiation. But at the moment, neither side can agree to the terms for dialogue and negotiation set by the other.
Yeah.
And both sides believe that they have the upper hand. Both sides believe that they've succeeded and come out victors from what happened in May. And therefore, at the moment, the likelihood of another conflict is far more dominant than the likelihood of any dialogue or negotiation. In that context and against that background, I want to bring up some very interesting things you write in that essay about nuclear deterrence. You say, whilst it can reduce the probability of full-scale conventional war, it may have incentivized risky confrontations that pass just below the ambiguous nuclear threshold. Are you suggesting there that future conflicts between India and Pakistan will not only be serious and dramatic, as we saw in May, but each could be worse than the previous one, because the escalatory ladder will ensure that if they're going to teach the other side a lesson, they have to begin at a higher pitch?
Yeah. So you know, if you take India's policy in 2019, India carried out airstrikes. Those airstrikes were obviously not sufficiently deterring in their effect. Now we have a 2025 crisis where India had to escalate, right, from airstrike into actually hitting deeper inside Pakistan and targeting military bases. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, there is, I mean, I would like to, I hope that both leaderships on both sides are sensitive to cost and benefits, that they're rational enough to keep the conflict under the nuclear threshold. The problem is that if, you know, because Pakistan's nuclear strategy or posture is first use, and they have Pakistan's nuclear higher ups or decision makers have indicated in the past that if Pakistan is, you know, if we don't have a way out, if we are losing our way, we are up against the wall, we will use nuclear weapons to deter India, right? And so that kind of conflict, it's unparalleled that there are two nuclear powers, nuclear armed powers, that are engaging in conventional conflict repeatedly. One side, as you said, is emboldened enough to believe that because there is a nuclear, sort of broader nuclear umbrella that prevents any escalation to a full conventional scale because of the fear of a catastrophic nuclear conflict, Pakistan believes that, you know, sort of needling India when need be will not produce sort of a, you know, will not escalate the conflict, because India will be afraid, or any rational decision maker would be afraid to escalate the conflict because of the danger of sort of a nuclear war.
Absolutely. And as long as Pakistan believes that they need to needle India, or they want to needle India, or they gain from needling India, and that's precisely the point you make when you say Indian attacks on militant sites in Murid and Bahawalpur did little to damage Pakistan's jihadi infrastructure. And then when you add, Pakistan fully retains its capacity to use terrorism to rattle India. If it does that, we get perilously close each time to something that could eventually, hopefully not, but could eventually become catastrophic. That's the danger we are condemned to live with for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Any crisis between two nuclear armed powers, you know, is a nuclear crisis because nuclear weapons are at play. And Pakistan's hope traditionally has been that before we go over the edge, the Americans will intervene, and the Americans have done that in 1919. They did it in apparently in 2019, and President Trump is now claiming that it was our intervention that sort of separated the two sides and ended the conflict. And so it works in Pakistan's favor to sort of use nuclear saber rattling, right, to scare the Americans and the international community to step in to stop the conflict, and that has worked so far.
Let me put you, as I end, a sort of contrarian view expressed by India's Chief of Defense Staff, General Chauhan, in the interview that he gave in Singapore on Saturday. He said, and I'm quoting him, "It's my personal view that the most rational people are people in uniform when conflict takes place. During this operation, I found both sides displaying a lot of rationality in their thoughts as well as their actions. And he went on to say that he believed that that would be precisely the case even if it came to the nuclear option. Both sides would be rational, both sides would shy away from that final catastrophic step. And what I want to ask you is, do you agree with this view that both sides are ultimately rational, or do you disagree?
I hope General Chauhan is right. I hope that decision makers on both sides can maintain that rationality no matter how far a crisis escalates. The problem is that there are always the danger of misperceptions, miscommunication, right? The psychological stress of a crisis, the fact that both sides don't trust each other. So eventually, hopefully, rationality will prevent a nuclear conflict. But that's hoping that that would happen is just not worth risking that conflict, right? That yes, we believe that both militaries or both leaders are rational, but do we want this region of 1.7 billion people to be hostage to the rationality of our leaders, or does that, if that makes sense, that why should we test that rationality at the cost of a potentially catastrophic conflict that wouldn't just hurt India and Pakistan? That would affect the world entirely, the entire world.
In other words, we need to rely on something more concrete and substantive than the presumed rationality of generals on either side or politicians on either side.
Given that we have a long history of war and warfare, and this is a rivalry that has endured, and there is no end in sight, I think that risking or sort of depending on the rationality of leaders is not the most stable foundation for making sure that Pakistan and India don't go to war. Even if it's a conventional war, it will be absolutely destructive for both sides, let alone a conflict in which nuclear weapons come into play.
Professor Aqil Shah, thank you for the time you've given me, and in particular, thank you for explaining and sharing the details of your essay for Foreign Affairs. I'll bring up, for the sake of an Indian audience, those two critical sentences which I think apply to an Indian audience more than they do to anyone else. Indian attacks on militant sites in Muridke and Bahawalpur did little to damage Pakistan's jihadi infrastructure. The ISI had ample time to relocate its prime assets to safety, and then you added, Pakistan fully retains its capacity to use terrorism to rattle India. That use of terrorism could spark off another war. And if it's only rationality that we're depending upon, we could just as easily, unfortunately, collapse into a nuclear situation. That is what I think people should hear very carefully.
Absolutely. This is dangerous. This is risky. And being confident in our ability to pull back just before we go over the edge is what kept the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans so risk-laden and so dangerous.
Professor Shah, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan. I appreciate your. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.